Hey everybody. Let's chat a little bit about the anatomy of arthropods. Um, so I like learning about this stuff because arthropods are something that we see all over the place. And since you see them all, it's all over the place. It's kind of nice to know a little bit about them. So let's get going. Now, arthropods in general have a three-part body plan: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And this picture on the right-hand corner shows you where those three segments are. But there is some variety in that depending on what we're looking at. So in many adult arthropods, the body segments fuse together. And when they fuse together, if you think of when we studied the annelids, think of how many segments they had. Or if you remember the myriapods that we looked at, they have a lot of segments as well. But in most arthropods, they're fused into three major regions. And like I already said, here this diagram on the right-hand side shows you those regions. So the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And on animals like ants and bees, and especially wasps, these three regions are really easy to see. Sometimes they're not super obvious on a few of them. Now, some arthropods, like lobsters and spiders, they have a head, so their head up here is actually fused with their thorax. So it's not two individual segments like you see in this ant. It looks like one segment. And so when that happens in an animal, we call that kind of body plan or that kind of region, we call it the cephalothorax. Cephalo refers to the head, and then thorax is the chest cavity area. So when those two are fused together, they fuse those two words together, cephalothorax. And you can see that in this spider diagram down here at the bottom right-hand corner. So you really only see two segments. The head with the eyes right here is fused with the thorax into one segment called the cephalothorax, and then there's the abdomen. Here in this little lobster-like guy, same thing. The head and the thorax are fused together, forming one region that we call the cephalothorax. Now, as far as organ systems, if we look at their digestive system, and if we look at that across the board with arthropods, we'll see that virtually every mode of feeding exists in arthropods. So there's carnivores, like a spider, there's herbivores, there's omnivores, and there's parasites. Now, arthropods typically have one or two main types of feeding appendages, so mouth parts. They have chelicerae, or you can say chelicerae. So chelicerae, think of like the fangs on a spider, like down here you can see these are the chelicerae of the spider. There's a close-up image. So chelicerae are when an animal has like pincers or fangs. So like centipedes also have chelicerae. And those type of animals can't chew their food. They use these pincers or fangs to deliver venom typically that also has a digestive enzyme that liquefies the internal structure of whatever they're preying upon. Another type of feeding appendage, are mandibles, which is the fancy science word for jaws. And so most arthropods typically have additional accessory feeding appendages near their mouth. Like crabs, we saw that video of the crab, and they had those little filter feeding mechanisms in the front of their mouth. But in general, these are the two most common, chelicerae and mandibles. Now, to continue with the digestive system, it includes the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestine, and the anus. Now, many also include specialized areas for storing or grinding food, the crop and the gizzard. And we saw and talked about what the crop and gizzard was with annelids, because the earthworm has that too. So remember, the gizzard has like little hard-like structures in it, the gizzard is muscular, and so they'll squeeze that gizzard when there's food in it, and the hard-like structures act like teeth. So in a sense, they chew with their gizzard. So we have the mouth, the crop, the gizzard. A lot of times they have accessory glands that secrete enzymes and digestive juices. Remember, that word secrete just means to leak out. So you secrete spit all the time, you secrete sweat all the time. So they have, depending on which type of arthropod we're talking about, they'll have additional glands like the salivary gland that you see in this grasshopper here. Now, the nervous system A complete nervous system includes a brain connected to a ventral solid nerve cord. And so remember, ventral is like the belly surface. So we have, in this diagram, we have the brain connected to a ventral solid nerve cord that's running down the whole length of the body of the animal. The head bears various sensory organs, so the head has some different sensory organs. Depending on which animal we're talking about, they have eyes from really, really simple to really compound, which means that they can see images and colors and have quite good vision. Think of the mantis shrimp that has the best vision of any animal on this entire planet, and it's an arthropod. Simple eyes they can typically have, and the fancy science word for simple eyes is oculi. And if they have simple eyes, like I was saying earlier, that just allows them to detect light or dark. Now, compound eyes, like I was saying, can have a lot of different lenses or facets, which are good at detecting movement, and also a lot of colors. Now, other sensory structures function for touch, smell, hearing, balance, and chemical reception. Among these, they have these little cuticle hairs are the most obvious ones, and they provide the input stage for an arthropod's tactile sense, meaning this is where they process that tactile information. And check out that little cute face of this spider right here. This is a jumping spider. And so he has his chelicerae right here. They're fairly hairy, so they're hard to see. He has multiple sets of eyes. He has some of those tactile hairs, those cuticle hairs that I was just talking about. And these two little short legs that you see right here are those pedipalps that we talked about when we were learning about spiders. Now, the respiratory system in arthropods, so like all animals, they need some way to exchange gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen. So arthropods need some kind of respiratory system since their waxy exoskeleton is impenetrable to air. And so also impermeable is the word I meant to say. So their waxy exoskeleton is impermeable to air. And so that means it kind of blocks the air. So they can't breathe in and out through their exoskeleton. A lot of animals, like the worms that we were learning about, those guys have to stay moist so they can exchange gases through their skin. So when the arthropods came up with the advantage of that hard exoskeleton that helps protect them from predators, there was some disadvantages to that. It meant that they had to have a different way of exchanging gases since they couldn't do it through their skin. They had to have that exoskeleton be impermeable to air so that they wouldn't lose water through that exoskeleton. Otherwise, they'd be in constant danger of dehydration. Now, the exception to this respiratory system is any kind of arthropod that lives in the water, so like crustaceans and aquatic insects or aquatic larvae. They breathe with gills, okay, just like fish do. Now, spiders have something a little bit different. They have something called book lungs, which are small, like primitive lungs. Now, book lungs have many invaginations, or what we also call pages, to increase the surface area, very similar to gills. So this increase in surface area means that they're good at doing gas exchange between air and blood. And so you can see those little kind of like pages to the book lungs. And so this allows a greater surface area for oxygen exchange. Now, most terrestrial arthropods, so terrestrial means living on land, breathe through a network of tubes called tracheae or trachea. So here in the grasshopper, you can see the various tubes throughout their body. Now, trachea serve as a way to deliver oxygen directly to cells so that it does not have to travel in blood. Air from the outside of the animal passes into the trachea by these special openings that you can see highlighted down here called spiracles. And these are open and closed by valves to let that air in and out. Now, if you do see a decent sized grasshopper and you pick it up and you gently look at it on the side here towards the ventral surface, you can see externally typically, you can see these spiracles. So if you ever see like any little holes or little circles on the side of their body, that's those spiracles. So if you think about that, they're breathing through these spiracles. So they're not breathing through their mouth. They're taking in air at the side of their body, which is kind of bizarre to think about. Now, like I was saying, the spiracles have these valves, and the valves also help prevent water loss. If they were just to stay open the whole time, water could evaporate out through those spiracles, which would really cause a problem for the animal. So things like these valves and that hard exoskeleton that stopped evaporation were key adaptations for insects to be able to live on land. Now, with the circulatory system of these animals, arthropods have an open circulatory system. So we have learned that there's two different types of circulatory systems we've looked at this year, open and closed. You and I have a closed circulatory system where the blood is enclosed in veins and arteries. So arthropods typically have an open circulatory system with a heart at the top of the body, okay, and you're seeing it up here. And then, so it's on the dorsal surface, and it squeezes blood out into the internal body spaces or openings. And we have a name for those spaces. The spaces is hemocoel. Now, if you remember, coel, C-O-E-L, is the beginning of that word coelom. And coelom is that big opening that organisms have if they have 3 germ layers. So hemo refers to blood. So this is just like an opening where blood squeezes out into. Now, they also have an excretory system. So arachnids and insects have Malpighian or Malpighian tubules as part of their unique excretory system. And it's unique. It's used to conserve water and eliminate waste. They collect waste from blood and empty that waste into the intestines so that water can be removed from the body, or water can be removed from the waste before the waste is removed from the body. Crustaceans also use antennal glands at the base of their antenna to regulate salt balance. So that's another way that they regulate water content as well. Okay, and so you see those, they're right here towards the anterior end of the animal, towards the ventral surface, antennae glands. And so regulating salt balance is important for any animal that lives in the water. Now, reproduction, most arthropods have separate sexes, so male and female, and most reproduce sexually. Terrestrial arthropods usually have internal fertilization. However, aquatic arthropods usually have external fertilization. And that's a common theme that we see throughout the animal world. Anytime you have an animal living in the water, for the most part, some mammals are definitely the exception, but most of the animals that live in water, they rely on water for transferring those sex cells from one living organism to the next, so they have external fertilization. But most terrestrial arthropods have internal fertilization. Now, metamorphosis is a big process. It's a big characteristic that arthropods have. And so, like I was telling you in class before, metamorphosis just means to change. So metamorphosis is a drastic change in form and physiology, so how the animal works, that occurs at an immature stage and becomes an adult. And so when I think about something called complete metamorphosis, which is the traditional type of metamorphosis that most of us think about, that's when you have a caterpillar that changes into a butterfly. So that is a very drastic change in form. It's also a very drastic change in physiology. This animal, the caterpillar, can chew and eat leaves. This animal, the butterfly, doesn't chew. It has a long tube-like mouth structure called a proboscis. So there's 2 different kinds of metamorphosis, complete and incomplete. Now, during complete metamorphosis, insects usually go through 4 different stages to become an adult. So they have a stage where they're an egg, and then they're a larvae, and then there's something that we call a pupa, and then an adult. So the larvae is usually wingless and worm-like. So we see lots of things that look like maggots, and they're not all necessarily maggots, because this worm-like structure is a common larvae form for arthropods. But think of the caterpillar. So it does not have wings, so it's wingless. It's worm-like. And it may involve several molts, meaning it's going to shed its exoskeleton to increase in size several times. The pupae is enclosed within some kind of protective capsule. And sometimes we call that capsule a chrysalis. So here in this butterfly, the caterpillar slows down, forms this chrysalis, where it will change, it will metamorphose into the adult form, the butterfly. And then the butterfly will reproduce, lay some eggs, and the process starts all over again. So that's complete metamorphosis. Okay? And this is just a diagram showing that in a little bit more detail. Now, okay, so moths and moths and butterflies are a little bit different. Most moth caterpillars spin a cocoon made of silk within which they metamorphose into a pupal stage. Most butterfly caterpillars, on the other hand, form an exposed pupa, which we call a chrysalis. So here's a butterfly chrysalis, not enclosed in silk, and here is a moth cocoon made out of silk. Now, the process from egg to butterfly is weather dependent and also depends on the regional climate. It can take about 4 weeks in the peak of the summer in warmer climates. The egg takes 5 to 10 days. The larva and chrysalis stage each take about 10 to 14 days. And if you add up, that all takes about 4 weeks. And I like this picture here, like how it shows the various stages from the caterpillar to the pupa with the chrysalis to emerging out into a full butterfly. Now, examples of insects that go through this are butterflies. So go through this means goes through complete metamorphosis. Butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, ants, bees, wasps. Okay? About 90% of all insects go through complete metamorphosis. So that's the majority. Complete metamorphosis contributes to the success of arthropods because the larval stage eats different foods and lives in environments that are different from the adult. Now that reduces competition. So meaning that the larval stages, since they live in a different place and they eat different food, they're not directly competing for space and food with their adults, which is a problem in the animal world. So lots of animals have different ways of dealing with that competition. And for this animal, their biggest way of dealing with that is to have their larval stages and their adult stages very, very different. So reduction in competition allows more members of the species to survive and exist at one time. Now, during incomplete metamorphosis, the other type, insects usually go through 3 different stages instead of 4. They have an egg, and instead of a pupa and a larvae, they have something called a nymph and then an adult. Now, when they hatch, they look just like small adults, and so we call those small adults nymphs. And if you remember, in complete metamorphosis, they have 2 very different body forms with totally different physiology. Think caterpillar, butterfly. They do not look like the same animal. These, if you look at the picture down below, we have little nymphs down here that look pretty much just like the adult animal. So nymphs have small wing buds instead of wings, so that means they cannot fly. Nymphs molt many times but do not become pupae. Each time they molt, they become larger. When they pull themselves out of their exoskeleton for the very last molt, they are adults. And then at that time, they'll have wings that work instead of just those wing buds. They'll be able to fly and at that time be able to mate. So that process of going egg, nymph, adult, that process where the young look pretty much just like the adult, that's how you recognize and tell incomplete metamorphosis apart from complete metamorphosis. Now, examples of insects that go through incomplete metamorphosis are like grasshoppers, cockroaches, mosquitoes, praying mantids. Mantids is the plural name for mantis, so praying mantis. And here is a little diagram that shows incomplete metamorphosis. So we have our eggs, and then here's the first stage nymph. Notice it looks like a grasshopper. Then they molt, get a little bit bigger. Okay, they molt, get a little bit bigger. They molt, get a little bit bigger, until they finally get to be an adult where they'll reproduce and start the cycle again. Now, there is another way that organisms, that arthropods can reproduce, and it's called parthenogenesis. And parthenogenesis is a type of asexual reproduction. Remember, anytime you add that letter A in the front of a science word, it means not, so not sexual reproduction. So this is a type of reproduction where the offspring develops from unfertilized eggs. So that means that they're going to be clones. So aphids produce clones of themselves and give live birth. Now, that's as much as I want to say on their body systems. And so take a moment, check your notes, and get those uploaded into Canvas.